Hi, everybody, and welcome to the final session of the VegfestUK Online November 14th, 15th, 2020 weekend, and this being the final live stream of the day two for the Wildlife Summit, which we've been producing today in conjunction with Animal Aid and also Humane Wildlife Solutions. And I'm very, very grateful to both those organisations for the considerable input that they've given for today's highly useful, very educative and informative, friendly, fun, and uplifting and inspirational look at some of the issues around wildlife from a vegan perspective. We've had some truly fantastic guests today, and it's all available on the VegfestUK website, archived there. If you're watching at a later date and you want to have a look at some of the other presentations, they're up there, as are all the live streams, and of course also on our social media pages. And on that note too, I'd like to thank a couple of the people who have been watching all the way through the weekend. Fair shout. We've had a few questions. We've had some very committed and faithful listeners and engagers. I'm very grateful for that. And on a broader note, all the people who've been sharing our work, the exhibitors, the contributors, it's been fantastic. So I'm glad to say that we're going to be joined by 3 out of 4 of our guests this evening. Unfortunately, Mr. Benny Malone cannot make it tonight. Something to do with his wife's birthday, which seemed to have got missed. I won't say any more. But Benny, we really look forward to seeing you at one of our shows in the future. We've got a book out, a really interesting, dynamic book coming out, of which I've had the pleasure to see, about fallacies and vegan, arguments and such. So it's been a really interesting guest, but not to worry. Benny, I'm sure, will come along on another day. He's got a very, very good excuse, if ever there was, although I'm not quite sure how he forgot it in the first place. But that is another story. For this evening, we are going to be looking at the rights of animal rights and how this impacts with live, free living beings, wildlife especially, how the general philosophy and principles of animal rights apply, I should say, to free living beings. And I'm very happy to be joined by 3 very esteemed guests, all of whom I'll introduce in a bit more detail. But please do welcome Mel Broughton, Jordi Casamitjana, and Lynn Sawyer is, I think, joining us too. Yes. Okay, so hello, everybody.
Hello.
Okay, so Mel, I'm going to just start with you because you're at the top right there. And Mel, you go back a long way with the animal rights scene. And in many respects, I think people will know you as somebody who's really helped formulate and shape animal rights philosophy over the last perhaps 30, 40 years. I know too that recently you've been in hospital after being attacked whilst hunt sabbing. And I do remember too being next door to you at the Animal Aid show, the Christmas show in I think 2008. I was next door to you on a stall with Yayo here, and we were next door to you with the Speak campaigns. And I think it was probably another 6 or even 7 years before we saw you again. Indeed, the same show, the Animal Aid show, the Christmas show. So I know that you've given a lot to the cause of animal rights. So we're very, 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 very grateful for you joining us today. First of all, Mel, how are you, sir? You good?
I'm okay, thank you. Yeah. As you said, you alluded to my recent hospitalisation after being attacked at a hunt. And that has obviously taken quite a bit out on me recently. The road to recovery is still going on after receiving multiple fractures and a tear on my lung after being ridden down by a member of the Pytchley Hunt. I won't go into too much detail at the moment because it's still in the hands of the police, and I'm awaiting some kind of indication about what's going to happen next. I have been involved in the animal rights movement a long time, thanks for that. How much of an influence I've been on that, I don't know. I'd like to think I've done some good. I think it's fair to say I'm probably quite a controversial figure, certainly in terms of the authorities, having served 2 prison sentences. But I think I've always believed, right from when I first got involved in 1980, that animal rights was something that spoke to me on a very, very fundamental level. And I always understood the principle of animal rights and still do. So it's something that is so central to my life that I couldn't imagine, even though things have not been easy, I wouldn't have had it any other way. Everything that's happened for a reason. I often say if I had to live my life again, I'd do the same again. So yeah, it's an amazingly important movement, incredibly important, and the principles of animal rights, as we're going to talk about them as this progresses, are more relevant than ever before. The world's changing at an amazing pace, and a lot of it not for the better. But one thing I think that animal rights and the things that have grown out the animal rights movement, like the massive increase in veganism, is something that's massively important for society. So for all of us involved in this, it's more important than ever. So any opportunity I can have to talk at things like this and be involved, then I'm always happy to do that.
Well, that's good news, because we've got a whole animal rights summit coming up next month, in December, where we're going to be focusing on animal rights, but we're also going to have a chance to go into a broader exploration of animal rights. Because, for the purposes of this conversation, we're just going to stick to a sort of basic principle of animal rights, which I'll come to in a minute. But I know that you'll be thrilled, Mel, by the recent achievements of Jordi here.
Yeah,
having the pleasure to chat to Jordi recently about his book. Of course, Jordi's got a book coming out in no less than a couple of weeks. December the 3rd, indeed, you'll be able to catch Jordi's book launch, indeed, on the somewhere around about this website, Facebook pages. And Jordi, you've really basically established, I suppose, in law now that there's a recognition of the ethical rights, ethical position rather of vegans. And that's quite a famous case. So again, we can devote a whole session at the Animal Rights Summit in December to explore that case in more detail. But for now, just give us a very brief, quick 2 or 3 minutes about yourself and where you are with this animal rights position here.
Okay, yes, I've been always involved with animals all my life. I studied zoologists. I studied them as an animal protection person that didn't know that study was just one dimension of what I wanted to do. But the more I look into them, I realized, okay, learning about them is not enough. I had to protect them. And I started moving into animal protection as such. And I worked for many organizations. I worked as an undercover animal protection person. I worked as a consultant. And eventually, through my work, I ended up being vegan. Obviously, at one point you click and you realize you can't just help an animal and eat another one. And through that process, I ended up being fired for being vegan by the organization I was working with. And of course, I tried to challenge that situation by taking my former employer to employment tribunal. And it took me 2 years of litigation to eventually find a resolution favorably to me. But I didn't know at the time that I was the first person trying to establish in the legal system that ethical veganism is a protected philosophical belief. I assumed that was already established, but then I realized that the judge had to confirm this with the first case. And mine was the first case. So I was lucky that after pursuing my case, the judge agreed. And it says, yes, ethical veganism is a protected philosophical belief under the Quality Act 2010. That means everybody that is an ethical vegan, and that means anybody that follows the definition of the Vegan Society of veganism. That means not just the diet, but every other aspect of one's life. So everybody following that definition is the same person is following the one I was following, and therefore is equally protected. And as a consequence of the fame that case brought me, because it was the first in the world known, and many people around the world were interested about the outcome of my case. So I decided to write a book about how I became vegan my entire life, what's the history of veganism in reality from millennia to now, and my actual case. And this is the book that's going to be published in a couple of weeks called Ethical Vegan. So that's kind of in 2 minutes my story.
Okay, thanks, Jordi. That's really interesting. And we've all, I think, followed your case. We've all been seeing it in the background for the last 2 or 3 years. And I think probably, a number of us have used the landmark case, which I believe was in January this year, to distinguish, I think, particularly the growth of, on the one hand, plant-based diets and the associated benefits, especially for environment, for sustainable food, and for health, especially with the whole food, unprocessed plant-based diet. But then the broader vegan position of not using any animals at all. And that would include, therefore, of course, animals that are used in laboratories, animals that are used in captivity or for entertainment. Or for, in this case, we're looking at the impact of humans and such like on animals in the wild. And Lynn, just to bring yourself in here, just to see if are we okay with our little minor text? I think, can you hear me?
Yeah, just about.
Okay. Well, we can hear you, so we shall progress, and I shall speak slowly and enunciate clearly to make sure that you can hear me. But Lynn, I know you've been working, protecting and conservation with wildlife for a number of years, but you're also, I think, probably would describe yourself as an ethical vegan.
Yeah.
Just tell us very briefly, just give a little bit of an introduction and background shortly to yourself here.
I mean, there's a ringing sound.
Okay, I think it's because you're in the hospital.
Yeah,
we can hear
there's a sort of ringing, echoing sound.
Quite a lot of background noise, so up to you, really. Okay, well, look, I think what we do is, Lynn, we'll just see if we can get you back into a better environment so that we can hear you. Just carry on with the conversation. Just try again. Let's see if we got a better. Can we hear you, Lynn?
Hello? Yeah, I can hear you.
Some difficulties here.
Everything I say echoes.
Yeah, this isn't really a satisfactory connection there, so not to worry. Look, I know it's very difficult for listeners when we can't get a decent connection and such like, so it's frustrating, but not to worry. I think Pete will try backstage, share the studio to, try and get Lynn back in if we can. But look, let's move on. So basically, what I want to talk to you really about is, the basic principle of animal rights is that animals should not be used as property, and that animals have a right not to be used. So when we're talking about farmed animals, that's a fairly straightforward principle to understand and apply. Is that animals should not be bred, should not be killed, should not be used as property. And the same for animals, in a laboratory. Animals should not be in a laboratory. Animals have a right not to be used for experiments, and animals have a right not to be used for entertainment. So we can apply these principles of justice for animals, we're relatively straightforwardly. But when we come to free living beings, how does this principle apply, and how does the understanding of animal rights apply to free living beings. So that's the area I just wanted to sort of start to talk about, and then perhaps to look at some of the conflicts that might arise potentially. So Mel, do you want to just lead with that about, you know, how you see animal rights applying with free living beings and wildlife in particular?
Yeah, obviously, like you quite rightly pointed out, when it comes to animals in farming or animal research, these animals are specifically bred and brought into being to be used and killed for these purposes, and that's a clear contravention of their basic rights, you know, to autonomy and to a life. And obviously, with wild animals, it gets a bit more complicated in the sense that they are living free, or as far as possible in a human-dominated world, that they are free-born and free-living. I would argue that the principle of autonomy for wild animals is still the same, in that their birthright is one where they have a right to live a life as far as is possible. And again, we have to deal with the fact that this is a very human-dominated world, and in fact, for all animals, you know, no matter where they are in this country, around the world, the impact by human beings on the environment has meant that even in these cases, many wild animals struggle to live a life of autonomy, even in, you know, areas of the world where wildlife still does exist. But I would argue very strongly that as an animal rights advocate, that the principle that the respect for their right as a free living individual, in other words, their right to live a life in a habitat that they evolved to live in, to breed, eat, and have a family life in that environment, is a principle that we have to respect as animal rights advocates. So that's the way I would see it, that although there are differences that we pointed out between those animals that we deliberately bring into being, the principle still applies as far as rights goes, in that wild animals must be afforded that basic right to explore their own life as far as is possible in their own wild habitat, their own home, and to have their own families and pursue their own beings in that way. And to me, that's how we should be looking at this. That's how we have to look at this. I think that you know, the idea of animal rights, as I understood it when I became involved in the movement, was one that still, you know, rings very strongly with me today. And I know some people fight shy sometimes of using the word rights for animals, particularly wild animals, you know, as a concept that these animals can't enjoy, but clearly they can. And the wild animals' rights can be severely compromised by the activities of human beings, whether it's, you know, where they come up against human beings in the countryside, through hunting, and all other kinds of activities that human beings involve themselves in. But I see it as essential that as animal rights activists, we extend the principle to wild animals in terms of their rights to exist as they are intended to exist. And I think that's quite, you know, I think that's an important point to, you know, to always bear in mind.
Okay, thanks, Mel. Well, look, I think we're joined back by Lynn now. So hopefully, Lynn, you are, yeah, Lynn saying hello, waving. So
Hello.
very briefly, and just Lynn, if you want to introduce yourself and say hello.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm just basically a bog standard SAB, coal SAB, animal rights activist, jack of all trades, who's been around for a little while. My background is I'm ex-hunt. I used to hunt myself, and then I turned against it back in 1994, and I've been basically doing basic animal rights stuff ever since. I was a midwife, lost my job because of the badger cull, and now I'm sort of a full-time SAB, a volunteer here at Vale, which is a wildlife hospital.
Okay, and then I do know, without going too much into it, I know that you have, like a number of people, paid quite a high price for your actions. You mentioned you've lost your job there, or you had to retrain, not continue down your chosen path. And I think, there's some other aspects that you suffered at the hands of it's been a punishment, I believe.
Yeah, I've been arrested more times than I can remember, house been raided, that sort of thing. I was seriously injured at an anti-vivisection protest. Hunting-wise, I've had a few cuts and bruises, but nothing serious, fortunately. But I think you compare it with what campaigners say in the Amazon go through, where they're actually tortured and killed, and so a lot of people have been through far worse. So I suppose, yeah, just sort of trudge on, I suppose, like we all do.
I think it's important, especially for the people coming into activism, to remember how much people have given to this movement.
Well, 2 SABs were killed. Mike Hill and Tom Warby were killed out in the field. Jill Phipps was killed, stopping a livestock lorry. So yeah, people have been killed and been to prison for a very long time, lost their jobs, lost their relationships. We had that a lot in the Badger Co. A lot of people ended up getting divorced. So yeah, there's a huge history of that happening, and you read right back what people went through. I can remember a story of there's a couple of stories of like hermits living in the wood, religious hermits, and saving deer and wild boar from hunters and getting badly beaten up. We're talking about a few hundred years ago, and dying as a result of trying to intervene with the hunt, which I find very interesting and something that should be remembered.
I absolutely agree with you. We should also remember all the people who've, are still currently too incarcerated. There's people incarcerated all over the world for standing up for animals and doing their very best to prevent the exploitation of animals. Lynn, I'll just as we've got you, I'm going to ask you too. I know Jordi's just waiting there and patiently listening, as interested as I am, I'm sure. We just asked Mal about, basically, we're just talking about the wildlife, especially, and how, this principle of sort of animal rights, which is the right not to be used as property, which is quite easy to understand when it comes to farmed animals or animals in captivity or animals in laboratories. How do you see that applying to sort of wildlife, and in particular the wildlife that you're protecting and working with?
I think the thing is, there's huge things that don't really get discussed in a vegan perspective, and huge moral mazes as well. So, for example, you go out on a hunt, you're there to protect the fox, also hounds and horses. That's quite simple. But for example, if you have a fox who needs some care, before being released again, the fox needs to eat meat. Or whatever, and the same with garden birds, etc. So a lot of the animals that you might rescue to release back into the wild require meat. Now that's obviously something that doesn't get discussed very often, and I think it's an interesting one to discuss. I don't think there's a scope for it in this instance, but it does. Also, what comes out as well is how even as vegans, we have a massive impact on the earth. I mean, I'm using a mobile phone. There's trees cut down, which are animals' homes, to make the minerals that are in this mobile phone that I'm using right now. So there's all sorts of questions that come up, I think, with wild beings. Of course, the best thing we can all do is not to to try and lessen our impact as much as possible. And veganism is a very important part of that. But also things like coffee and other luxuries are things to be considered and discussed, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. As especially that phrase you used there, the moral maze. So we might come back to that in a bit. That Lynn.
One example of that is, you might have a pigeon who's being eaten by a goshawk, and the pigeon's still alive, and you're there, and you could scare the goshawk away and maybe try and rescue the pigeon. What would be the moral act there? I don't know. Because the goshawk needs to eat and feed his family, but the pigeon is there being ripped apart in front of you. So morally, where do we go there? And it's an interesting discussion to be had, I think.
So, Jordi, what do you think about that? I mean, I know that you've got some particular lifestyle sort of choices. I believe you, for instance, you avoid transport wherever possible because of the impact that this has on free living beings. So how do you feel? I mean, you've heard Mel and Lynn both talking about this sort of principle that we apply, or rather recognise that applies for animals. How do you see that working in the wild, as it were?
Yes, I agree with both. I agree that animal rights applies to all animals, regardless who they are. If we only decide to apply it to some animals, we will be speciesist, which is what we try not to be. So to be coherent, you cannot apply the rights to the animals that you like the most, or the animals that you can apply them because they are easy to apply because you're closer to them. However, how you apply them and in which circumstances you intervene and what you do, that's what varies. But it doesn't vary in between captive domestic animals and wild animals. It varies with particular species, with particular individuals in particular situations. The most important thing, I think, for me to consider is that the concept of animal rights, as you describe it, as concerning of not treating them as property, this is just one dimension of the concept. It goes beyond that. It's not treating them as objects. In fact, when it was first defined by many years ago by Henry Salt, he went beyond the property. He was talking about the animals possess a distinctive personality, therefore they're entitled to possess their own existence. That means they cannot be treated as furniture, an object. It doesn't need to be a possession. It just needs to be respected and allow them to survive in the way they normally survive. So if you interfere with their life, what counts? If we apply this principle to all the animals, and I think that's what animal rights is have this equal consideration with all animals and try to harm them as little as possible with our actions. If we apply this to us in our actions, that's easy. For instance, in the case of wild animals, what we do that affect them. We pollute the environment, we should stop. We hunt them, we should stop. We reduce their habitat, so they're forced to move from one place to another and perhaps have an overpopulation of predators or prey when they should not be. Well, we should connect the ecosystem to prevent that happening. So when we are the direct cause, that's easy because we're still responsible for the suffering of the wild animal as we are responsible for the suffering of the domestic animal. But the dilemma is what Lynn says, is what happened with that suffering that we are not directly responsible. A predator hunting a prey, a disease that is naturally occurring, a case of animals that breed many offspring because they know only a couple survive, and what happened with all the others that die of starvation. Should we intervene in that question? And this is a pure classic dilemma, and Lynn is right. You ask vegans, some vegans will say yes, other vegans will say no. We haven't arrived to consensus on this. I have thought about this, and as you rightly so, I even considered my transport options because I'm thinking about the wildlife that might be affected, even accidentally by me being part of that. So in my book, I actually have a whole chapter about this. I arrived to a conclusion, a concept I call the ordeal involvement. It is basically, I make a decision on a case-by-case basis after analyzing the consequences of my actions. For instance, in the case of a sparrowhawk and the pigeon that you mentioned, I would look at the circumstances of the occasion. I would look, do I know whether this sparrowhawk needs this prey? Is it feeding an offspring or is not feeding an offspring because it's not the right time of the year? Does it feel healthy or it feels not healthy? What about the pigeon? So I treat both prey and predator equally. I make an assessment with the knowledge I have, and then I intervene if I think I can, and I'm not making the thing work. In some cases, the intervention will be in favor of one, in the other in the favor of another. And I might be wrong, and I have no guarantee I might be right. But at least I apply the veganism principle of considering equally everyone and trying my best to help everyone. Whether I achieve it or not, I don't know, but that's the way I do it.
Okay, thanks, Jordi. That was really interesting. And I, it's that intent to try do your best. But Lynn, you mentioned some conflicts. That's something I wanted to come on to. Kevin's posted, actually, I will post it. I'll come back to this, which is the answer about the goshawk, about his opinion on that one. The goshawk and the pigeon. We'll come to that. But Mel, I think one of the things I wanted to try and do with this was to try and provide some of this work will be going out, particularly over the next 2 or 3 months. As you know, a large amount of people traditionally now in the first month of the year are beginning to discover a plant-based diet. There's a big push for, could well be up to 500,000 people, going plant-based for a month. And we want to try and, make sure that there's some really good resources looking at animals, animal rights, and centering animals to give, in a friendly, supportive way, some informative, educative, inspirational sort of material for people. We understand that when you're new to all of this, just getting a first plant-based diet sort of routine together is a big enough deal. But it's important to have those considerations to be going on. So what I wanted to ask you particularly, because we've only got a short period, and as I mentioned, there is another summit, Animal Rights Summit, where we'll be able to explore these in more detail. And I'd like to invite, in fact, at this point, all three of you to put forward, whole topics for discussion if you'd like to head up and spend a whole hour delving. Yeah, there you go, Lynn. Because this is just sort of scratching the surface, as it were. But on that note, I was thrilled to see that Kevin from Humane Wildlife Solutions has put forward his own opinion about a solution to some of the conflict, Lynn, that you see arising. So Mel, what would you use as some guiding principles, and what some conflicts? I wanted to just talk about some of the conflicts that might arise, and about what you see. What do you use to guide you?
That is quite a big question, actually. What do I use to guide me? Yeah. Well, I'd say that I'll go right back to the beginnings of my involvement in the animal rights movement. I was, as a child, was deeply disturbed by cruelty, injustice, and suffering. Deeply disturbed by it, and as I grew, those kind of feelings also grew intensely. But like most people, I hadn't really considered properly how that impacted on non-humans, on animals. But once I started to think about that, and I actually started to think about it an awful lot, the idea of animal rights suddenly made the most enormous sense to me. And what I mean by that is that you have to kind of almost shed all your preconceptions about what animals are and what you thought about them. You have to change completely, because what you're talking about is such a seismic move away from what most people think about animals, and in fact what all human society thought about animals for centuries. You have to offload all that and then begin to look at it in a completely different way. Now, I'm someone who's a big, I think human rights is probably one of the greatest things that human beings have achieved, and I see no logical reason why that cannot be extended to non-humans. But I also understand very clearly that history, our whole history on this planet, has been one of utter domination. In the beginning over each other, due to our gender, colour, religion, whatever. But for animals, it was everything. I mean, the domination was total. From the moment the first animal was hit with a stick or had a rock thrown at it, it's almost like this awful process was set in motion. And until, let's be honest here, very, very relatively recently, that's the way it's been. And the abuse of animals, the use of animals has been supported by science, religion, philosophy, educators. And the fact that what I would say to people is, remember that, and also remember that you have to, as I said earlier, you have to come into this and offload everything you thought before you thought was right about animals, particularly where in a world where animal welfareism is the buzzword. And for me, animal welfareism was always a misnomer. It was always it was never meant for animals. It was meant for people. It was meant for those who exploit animals. So I would say to people who are coming in to the animal rights movement, particularly, and whatever issue they're dealing with, that once you have accepted that things are never going to be the same again for you, but also that you cleared your mind of that, and then you start to think about this in an animal rights way, then these things start to fall into place. And all the issues that we're talking about, to do, whether it's hunting or farming, vivisection, whatever, these things are still by and large accepted by most of society. It's only the emergence of the animal rights movement in the last 3 or 4 decades that's really began to question that. So we're still in our infancy. So I'd say to people, we're still in our infancy, and there's a lot to be hopeful about. Just think of what's happened already. I mean, Jordi's recent success is testament to that. What he did with the law is one of those stepping stones that gives us all hope for the future. So although the task is absolutely enormous, it's also doable. It's absolutely doable. So my principle, I suppose what I would say to people again is free your mind completely. Forget what was before. We're building for the future now, a future where animal rights is respected. And I ultimately hope that, I know that one day, society and indeed the law will not only recognise that animals have rights, but they will be enshrined in law. And it'll be a very, very different society. And so the movement that people are getting involved with is one that is going to be seismic in what happens in the future of this planet. Because animal rights, the growth of veganism is probably, I would say, forget Donald Trump and the rest of these idiots. I would say we are the people that matter now. We are the people that are going to change the world for the better. So, yeah, I hope that's probably a bit convoluted and a bit.
It's really interesting listening to you, Mel. And I think a lot of people do find you just inspirational because you have kept at it. And one thing I noticed interviewing Peter Regan today, chatting with Peter. Peter's considerably older than ourselves, indeed, but he's been vegan only the last few years. And he was talking quite articulately today about animal rights and animal welfare. And I noticed that was quite interesting that Peter had developed this, and his journey has been a journey. He's been an animal advocate before he went vegan, and then he's sort of gone vegan, and now he's developed a bit of an animal rights understanding. I think in part because there is some really good animal rights input in the vegan movement, and there's some good spokespeople. There's some good understanding of this, and I do agree that it gives a great hope for the future that this is becoming kind of I know that Donald Watson talked about ripening people to the idea of veganism, and I think talking about rights-based language and just introducing those ideas that animals have a right not to be used, and that animals can be equal to ourselves, and that's quite a big change. Is noticeable. Lynn, I've noticed you asked a really good question there. I'm just going to bring you back in there. And actually, there's been an answer from Kevin about what you think about the goshawk and the pigeon. And it's an interesting one because it involves a principle here that Kevin from Humane Wildlife Solutions. So Kevin works with this. This is his job, actually. Kevin says that morally, we need to stand back and to allow the goshawk to eat the pigeon. Otherwise, we're imposing human intentions on the natural world again. And this is what we should be avoiding. So that's quite a challenge for somebody who has an animal rights perspective, but also a compassion for animals and wants to naturally save animals. So what do you think about that? Can we just have that back up again, then? That answer. Thank you. What do you think, Lynn?
I've just read that, and I think that I would agree with Kevin. I mean, I had an incident a couple of weeks ago where I had a pigeon. The goshawk could, obviously I'd walked along and the bird of prey had gone and the pigeon was left with his guts hanging out, really. So was put to sleep. There's no way of saving him. And I think another thing to consider once you've got unless the injuries are superficial and you're not going to see unless you get right close up, by which time the goshawk is gone, you're not going to see how bad the injuries are. And with a wild animal, there is, they're going to suffer a lot of shock seeing a human being. They're going to be frightened. They're going to be in pain, and they're probably not going to make it. So there's that to take into consideration as well. So I think I would agree with Kevin, but you might end up with a situation where there could be different, slightly different, where a different premise might apply.
I kind of agree with you. I think you've got to look at everything by each time you've got to look at it. Because
I also agree with what Jordi said, but it's a completely. I think the way I see it, I think, regarding wild beings and human beings is we are part of this circle of life. We're part of, and we've got to train ourselves to get away from that. We're up here, and every we're the pinnacle of evolution type nonsense, and just regard ourselves as another species. And good and bad things happen. Now, I think if it's a matter of another thing, for example, is if you come across a hedgehog covered in ticks, so does the tick have a right to, because the only way you're going to save that hedgehog is by taking all the ticks off. So again, you've got the parasitical thing, and I think in that case as well, I think it would be right to intervene and save the hedgehog, but maybe other people would think differently. But I think the main thing is just like trying to do the right thing, rather than just riding roughshod over nature, so to speak. And those we're trying to help or let live their own lives, But to add to that, I would think that a lot of the wild animals that are found by the roadside, or found with parasites, or very often it's because of human intervention, stress, their immune system's breaking down because of what we're doing to them. So I think we have a responsibility to help where we can. So there's that as well,
What do you think, Jordi, about resolving conflict with wildlife? Because Lynn, what I do, you are out on the field, as it were, front line. I know that's what you do. And it's something different from theorising and talking about principles and perhaps more, as it were, academic approach. But Jordi, I know you've really thought this through, and you put these principles into your life. And what do you see? Is there anything you would like to add about potential conflict and principles of resolving conflict when you come across it?
Yes, there is a big distinction between ethics and moral, and that might help many to understand how to approach this. Ethics is this understanding what's right and wrong that we all agree. There might be different cultures that agree with different ethics, but once you agree with one particular type of ethics, you know what's right and what's wrong. While morals is how you apply those ethics according to the experience you had in your life with the situation you encounter. For instance, in general, I would say the ethical principle to let nature do its course and let predators to attack prey, that's a good principle. We should not intervene unless we know that we're not making things worse for either side, including the predator. But there might be situations where you encounter yourself in which you know that you can intervene, not making things worse, because you have particular knowledge about these individuals, because you have particular knowledge about the circumstances. And then this is your own personal experience that applies on top of your ethics. And that becomes your moral, your particular moral way to deal with it. For instance, in 99% of the cases I will see a predator hunting a prey, I will apply the ethical principle because I probably can't make things better for anyone. So I will allow the predator to do it. But there was a case no long ago which I did intervene, a spider that was about to eat a wasp. And I had a personal relationship with wasp. My morals pushed me towards looking at this case particularly. So I had to think right, and I realized that the spider had eaten another wasp because it was dead behind it. I realized there were many wasps around. I realized the wasp had not been stung yet, so it was perfectly healthy. So the only thing I could do is to cut the thread between the spider and the wasp to give both an equal chance to survive, and that was my intervention. In that case, I didn't think that I did the life of the spider any detriment because he would be fed easily that day and had indeed been, and yet I had the wasp. That was my personal relationship with wasp because that was my PhD study. I studied wasp. That push towards that decision. So my moral approach to wasp is different than anybody else's. And the same thing with all the animals you encounter. You have to apply your own personal experience in addition to the ethics that we all agree. And when you do that, you might realize that some people have answers different than others, and that should be okay. What it should be right is that everybody tries to help everyone, not just one animal, not just the other, not just predators, not just prey, not just wild, not just domestic. If you try to help anyone, being a human, you're going to fail sometimes, but if you try, we are at the same level. We are then animal rights people.
Thank you for that. I think just touch on that point too, which I think is useful for people, is that, look, there isn't a perfect answer. There's not always a correct. It's about how you choose to react to those things and how to process what's in front of you and available at the time. So, and I think there is a misconception that animal rights or what was this someone loosely called extreme veganism is about purity and perfection. Of course, it's not really. It's about understanding principles and developing and furthering your understanding of this, but also applying principles of compassion and kindness and supportiveness wherever you can too, and try and help where you can. Is that intent sometimes is really, really important, and just recognizing that we're not always able to resolve things. We're as I thought would happen, with three very interesting guests, plus myself. I don't mind talking a little bit myself. So we're going to be short of time. So I'm going to just jump actually to one of the things that we've been trying to highlight throughout this summit, which is not just to talk about these issues and address some of them, offer some resources, but also to encourage people to get active and to take action wherever we can. That's not always possible for people. And in many respects, adopting a plant-based diet and becoming vegan is a huge activism in itself. But just briefly, a couple of minutes each maybe. Mel, I know you're a big fan of protests outside. You do a lot of street work. You do make sure the public stay informed about issues. You're also out there sabbing. What would you advise people to do, particularly about perhaps wildlife and getting active with wildlife?
I suppose I've got to say with wildlife, then become a hunt saboteur, join the hunt saboteurs. I first went sabbing in the early 80s when hunting was legal, and I've returned to sabbing in the last couple of years or so when hunting is illegal. What I've discovered is very little's changed out there. Very little's changed. Animals are being hunted with almost impunity, with an appalling attitude from the police. I know that probably most of you have seen from the recent webinar leak. These people are basically involved in, they're a criminal gang. So I would encourage people, if you're fit enough and you feel able enough to get out there. One of the great things about hunt saboteurs always was, and I go back to my roots from the animal rights movement in the early 1980s, it's how I began in lots of ways. It's the first sort of action I ever took. And going out with other hunt saboteurs taught me a lot about working with other people, looking out for other people, and working as a team. And that, sort of held me, sort of gave me guiding principles, for my future involvement in the animal rights movement. I would say that going back to hunt sabbing recently has been a real eye opener for me. I don't think I've spent more time being knocked in ditches or knocked on my arse, in my whole life. But I'm still glad that I did it. I'm still glad that I am doing it, and I'll do it as long as I'm physically able to do it. And I would say to anyone who's thinking about it, do it. Get out there. There's a real sense of doing something, and I can say from a very recent experience, in fact, only a few weeks ago, it's an incredible experience to see a fox get away and know you had something to do with it. To see it break away, run, and give it a chance of life, and know that you played a part in that. It's very empowering. It fills you with a kind of, an enthusiasm as well. And obviously, you are dealing with, you're going out there and dealing with people who are arrogant, often quite violent, but ultimately, they are kind of just an awful anachronism from the past. They have no future. They know they have no future. And the more people that get out there and get involved, the sooner this will be over. And I think one of the things that I think is quite important from an animal rights perspective is hunting is one of those issues that's like a thorn in the side. We shouldn't be having to deal with this now. It should have been done. It really should have been done. And the sooner we can get this over, the sooner we can concentrate on all the other important stuff that we've got to do. So, please, if you can help your local hunt sabs, please do. Your help will be more than appreciated, and your efforts will be rewarded.
Well, Mel, I know that you've I know from Facebook feeds that you certainly put hunt sabs in the picture recently. The level of support and visibility for hunt sab groups has risen in the last couple of months. And that's in part, I think, because of the shock and horror that reeling through the activist community, not only the horrific injuries that you suffered, but the just outrageously appalling attitude from people who clearly have no regard for wildlife, but also for human life too. So yeah, hunt sabs. There you go. There's Mel's recommendation. Very briefly, Lynn, I know you do a lot of badger culling work or protecting badgers from the cull. Would that be? What's your call for action?
I just want to. Yeah, I would just reiterate what Mel just said. What we've done in Gloucestershire when the cull came here is we just said there's a job for everybody, yeah, and you don't, people can obviously people should join SAB groups if they can and wish to. But what we encourage people to do, we encourage people to learn how to map breed. We have workshops. We get people out looking at the countryside. We get them going into woods, and they're finding stuff. You know, it's not just badgers that are in cages. There's snares. There's you know, like fen traps, etc., etc. The more people we have on the ground going for walks and rambling and looking around, people are finding badgers in snares. People are finding animals in fen traps and so on and so forth, or animals that have been injured that are then able to be helped. So that's a massive thing. Just get out in your own area, find out what's there, and just learn a bit about how you can help wildlife. We get people checking sets regularly. We map them. We work with the Badger Trust, and we work with the police. Actually, the police in Gloucestershire are fairly good. We report. What we have done is a big reporting drive on badger set blocking and set interference. Now, most set interference and blocking is the hunting fraternity. And we have managed to have a major impact on that. They are doing it far less now. The other thing, of course, is development. So find out where the houses are being built, where HS2 is, and do what you can to protect the wildlife there. Unfortunately, it's like a juggernaut of destruction, the developing arm of it all. And one of the main reasons we think for the badger cull was not necessarily the dairy industry, but to remove the Badger Act by the back door for developers, because the amount of development going on across the UK is incredible. Woods, fields, ditches, hedgerows are just being ripped out left, right, and centre, and all of these places are where wild beings live. So for people to get to grips with their development laws, what's going on, wherever you live, even if it's in a city, you can do something for local wildlife in where you live. And we would encourage people to do that and to learn more. And certainly where our speciality is with badger sets is we encourage people to go out, adopt a couple of sets and keep an eye on them. And the more people that do that, the more reporting there is, we can get a better picture of what's going on and deter people from digging out sets and badger baiting and all of those sort of things.
Okay, thanks, Lynn, and thanks for mentioning too about the HS2 and the need to take action wherever you can to protest against development. That's a really, really interesting point, and one I think everybody can get involved with. You mentioned people who live in cities, or of course people who are not necessarily in a position to get out and you know, for maybe physical.
What I would say as well is one of the things that with the badger cull is a lot of people that couldn't get out in the field did things like Freedom of Information Act requests. So they'd notice something that might be useful, and they do a Freedom of Information request, or enable others to get out. And that works for sabbing as well. It might not be for you, you know, it might be something you think, well, I don't want to do that, but can you babysit? Can you dog sit? You know,
yeah, you can be a support.
enabling, not just necessarily donating or whatever, but can you dog sit with somebody while they go out sabbing? You know, maybe offer that. Just thinking, like with the badger cull, of course, people were away for 6 weeks, and they were enabled by people who were taking responsibility for those that needed care by the SABs in the field and the patrollers. So, you know, certainly thinking about things like that, or even, there's lots of things. Just think about it. Support things.
Thanks for that, Jordi. Just before we go now, we've got to wrap up. I know our teams have all been working long and hard all weekend, and I could quite happily go on for another hour, but I'm sure my team might have a few things to say about that. But Jordi, I know you've got your book out. It's coming out in a couple of weeks. I would heartily recommend people to have a pre-order and a look at that, because I think it's going to be a really interesting book. So, you know, call to action buy Jordi's book in a couple of weeks. But that aside, very briefly, what would your sort of last few words, perhaps, input on getting active and what people can feel to do to try and help with this situation?
Well, in addition to all the things that have been said, which are there, right? And the budget call, I would recommend that. But the first thing I would say, the first thing anybody can do is assess your own attitude towards wild animals and check whether this is the right one, that you treat them equally. When you go out with your dog, don't let your dog to chase the squirrel. The squirrel matters as much as your dog. Just because the dog is yours, the squirrel is also important. Start looking at all the wild animals as anybody that you care, animal or otherwise, and apply that new way of looking in any decision you have that concerns them. Change your way of looking at animals because they are as important as yourself.
Brilliant, Jordi. I agree with that absolutely wholeheartedly. It's the best thing I think we do is just change the way we look at animals. And even if you're already vegan, I would heartily recommend that you do a little bit of looking into animal rights theory. Tom Reagan is a great start. There's also a really good show called The Animal Rights Show that's every week that is free to access. So some great resources. Thank you ever so much for joining us. There's going to be another summit, not only animal rights in December, but at the end of January, we're doing activism too. So we're going to do a whole day looking at activism. So again, I would extend my invitation to all three of you to come and join us for both those summits. And you can choose your topics, you can lead, and you can develop them a little bit further than where we've been able to go today. But today was always about, being part of a wildlife summit and trying to address some of these areas, some inspiration, some education, some direction, and that I think we've definitely achieved. So not only are we saying thank you and good night to Mel, Lynn, and Jordi, but we'll also be saying goodbye to Kevin and Jade too, who I think are just waiting to say goodbye to us, who've been putting this together this weekend alongside our good selves. Jade, Kevin, thank you ever so much. I found it very, very interesting. We've had some fantastic guests.
Yeah, it's been a fantastic day. Thanks, Mel, Jordi, and Lynn for finishing up the summit today. It's been great listening to the three of you speak, and all the speakers that's been on, and everyone who's watched this whole day of the Wildlife Summit. It's been a fantastic day. And Tim, thank you for enabling this to happen, because without you, none of this would be here. We would be here wrapping up this show.
On that note, and shoot, you say nice, I'm sure all of us would say the same, as a nice wholehearted thank you to Pete, who's been working busily backstage, seamlessly, making sure that we overcome any tech problems and everything else. So Pete, well done, mate. Happy days. You should be proud of yourself for that one. And Jade, thank you very much. Thank you for all the work Animal Aid do. And I suppose, I think it's probably fair to say that if you are listening here, you want to get involved with wildlife, animalaid.org.uk is probably the best starting place.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's been a really wonderful day, and I've had some, been able to interview some fantastic people, and just listening to every talk. And just to mention, we do have a few pre-recorded talks also available on the VegfestUK website if anyone wants to have a look, if they want to watch a few more. But yeah, it's been a fantastic day.
All right, guys and girls, everybody, folks, I should say, thank you ever so much for coming and listening and working with us. It's an absolute pleasure. We're going to wrap up now. That's it for the VegfestUK Online, November 14th, 15th. We will be back on December the 12th and 13th, again to January the 30th and 31st. And until that time, so we wish you all goodbye and thank you again. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.